The walk-in refrigerator of Aura was Florian's sanctuary, a freezing steel vault where the chaotic heat of the Michelin-starred kitchen couldn't reach him. But tonight, the chill creeping into his bones had nothing to do with the temperature. Through the slight crack of the heavy metal door, he heard his wife, Corinza, speaking softly in the darkened wine cellar. Her voice, usually sharp and authoritative as the restaurant's general manager, was now a breathless, tender whisper. "I know he's suspicious, but I'll see you tomorrow at the hotel." "Yes, I love you too, Faustine." Florian stopped breathing. Faustine, the ruthless food critic who had nearly destroyed their life's work 6 months ago. If stories of dark ambitions, culinary obsession, and the devastating price of betrayal speak to your soul, stay with me. The walk-in refrigerator of Aura was Florian's sanctuary. Amidst the relentless, suffocating heat of the Michelin-chasing kitchen, this freezing steel vault offered a rare commodity: absolute silence. The temperature hovered just above freezing, preserving the delicate microgreens and the dry-aged venison, but more importantly, it preserved Florian's sanity. It was a Friday night, the peak of the Copenhagen culinary season. Outside these heavy metal doors, pans were flaming, plates were clattering, and a brigade of chefs moved with militant precision under Florian's tyrannical command. He had stepped into the coolers simply to breathe, resting his forehead against the chilled steel shelving, letting the cold seep through his chef's whites to cool his racing blood. The wall separating the walk-in fridge from the private wine cellar was notoriously thin, a structural flaw in the historic 18th century building that they had never bothered to fix. Usually, it only transmitted the muffled clinking of expensive Bordeaux bottles. But tonight, a voice bled through the frost-covered wall. It was Corinza. Her voice was distinct, carrying that elegant, slightly husky cadence that had charmed thousands of elite diners and, a decade ago, had completely captivated Florian. But she wasn't using her professional, polished tone. She was speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper, vibrating with an intimacy that made the hair on the back of Florian's neck stand up. "I know it's risky," Corinza murmured, her voice filtering through the steel. "He's been acting strange all week. He barely sleeps. He just stares at the prep stations until dawn." Florian held his breath. A cold dread, far more piercing than the air of the refrigerator, began to coil in his stomach. "I can't tonight," she continued, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "I have to stay until the last table clears. But I'll come to the d'Angleterre tomorrow afternoon. Room 412, right?" Florian's fingers gripped the edge of a stainless steel prep tray. His knuckles turned white. The Hotel d'Angleterre, the most luxurious hotel in Copenhagen. There was a pause as she listened to the person on the other end of the line. Then, a soft, devastating laugh, a sound Florian hadn't heard directed at him in over a year. "I know," Corinza whispered, her voice softening into a velvet purr. "I miss you too. I love you, Faustine." The name dropped into the freezing air like a lead weight. Faustine. The world tilted. The faint hum of the refrigeration unit seemed to roar in Florian's ears, drowning out all thought. Faustine, the man who, barely 6 months ago, had published a 2-page spread in the leading European culinary gazette, methodically tearing Aura apart. Faustine, whose venomous words about Florian's stagnant creativity and soulless execution had cost them a fortune in cancellations and nearly driven Florian to the edge of a bridge. His wife, his anchor, the woman who had held him as he wept over that very review, was now slipping away to a luxury hotel suite to sleep with the architect of his destruction. Florian didn't scream. He didn't burst out of the heavy door to confront her in the cellar. He stood perfectly still amongst the hanging cuts of meat, feeling something fundamental and vital inside of him snap. The warmth of love, the desperate need for his wife's approval, the shared dream of building an empire. It all froze, hardening into a sharp, jagged spike of ice. He slowly released his grip on the steel tray. He smoothed the front of his pristine white apron. His reflection in the polished metal surface showed a man who looked exactly the same as he had 5 minutes ago, but the eyes looking back were dead. He pushed the heavy door open, stepping back into the inferno of the kitchen. "Chef," his sous chef called out, wiping sweat from his brow. Table 4 is waiting on the venison. We need your call. Florian looked toward the swinging doors of the dining room, knowing Corinza was out there, smiling her beautiful, treacherous smile. Fire it, Florian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Fire everything. The memory of the day the review dropped tasted like copper and old blood. It was a bleak Tuesday in November, 6 months before the hushed confession in the wine cellar. The European Culinary Gazette had arrived wrapped in its usual glossy plastic, but to Florian, it felt like a death warrant. Faustine was not merely a critic. He was a kingmaker, and occasionally an executioner. That month, he had chosen the guillotine for Aura. Even now, amidst the chaotic symphony of searing scallops and clattering copper pans, the exact phrasing of Faustine's article burned behind Florian's eyelids. Aura presents a tragedy of miscalculated textures, drowning in a chef's bloated, fragile ego. Florian has built a beautiful mausoleum in Copenhagen, where culinary innovation goes to die quietly, a soulless execution of past glories. The fallout had been apocalyptic. The reservation book, a sacred ledger usually booked solid 3 months in advance, suddenly bled with red lines of cancellations. The phones, previously ringing with the chaotic energy of high demand, fell into a suffocating, echoing silence. But the true devastation was not financial, it was psychological. The review had shattered the delicate glass architecture of Florian's sanity. Instead of turning to his wife, his partner in every triumph and failure, Florian had turned inward, locking himself inside a prison of his own obsessive insecurities. He became a ghost haunting his own kitchen. He stopped returning to their beautiful apartment in Nyhavn, choosing instead to sleep on a narrow, grease-stained cot in his cramped office. He began throwing away entire shipments of Alba truffles and line-caught turbot, screaming at his terrified brigade that the ingredients were infected with mediocrity. And then there was Corinza, beautiful, resilient Corinza, who was left to absorb the impact of the crash all by herself. While Florian descended into his culinary madness, she was the one standing at the maitre d' podium, a painted-on smile masking her terror as she faced a half-empty dining room. She was the one taking the humiliating calls from their bank managers and anxious investors. Florian vividly remembered a night in late December. It was 3 a.m. The kitchen was finally dark, smelling of bleach and exhaustion. Corinza had walked down the stairs, her black velvet dress rustling softly, her heels clicking against the pristine tiles. She had looked so incredibly tired, the shadows under her eyes bruising her flawless skin. She had approached him from behind as he sat at his prep station, staring blankly at a row of dull knives. She wrapped her arms around his rigid shoulders, pressing her cheek against his back. "Florian, please come home," she had whispered, her voice cracking with a vulnerability she rarely showed the world. "The restaurant is bleeding, I know, but we will survive this. I am here, but I need my husband. I am so cold in that apartment alone." Florian closed his eyes against the memory. What had he done? He had shrugged her off. He had physically pulled away from the only warmth left in his life. "Aura is dying, Corinza," he had snapped, his voice hollow and cruel, never turning to look at her. "I am fighting for my life in here. I don't have the luxury of being a husband right now. Leave me to my work." He remembered the agonizing silence that followed, the slow, deliberate sound of her footsteps retreating up the stairs. He hadn't realized it then, blinded by his own wounded pride, but he understood it now with sickening clarity. That was the exact moment the fracture became a chasm. He had pushed her into the freezing void of neglect, leaving her completely untethered. As he mechanically plated a delicate arrangement of sea urchin and fermented white asparagus for table 7, the horrific irony of the situation settled into his bones like a terminal diagnosis. He had built the tomb, just as the review said, and in his absence, Faustine, the man who had handed him the shovel, had simply walked through the open doors and offered his shivering wife a fire. The days following the revelation in the walk-in refrigerator were a masterclass in psychological torture. Florian, a man accustomed to controlling every degree of heat, every grain of finishing salt, now found himself entirely powerless in the center of his own life. He chose silence. It was a suffocating, venomous silence, but it allowed him a grotesque vantage point. Armed with the devastating knowledge of Corinne's secret, the scales fell from his eyes. Suddenly, the restaurant was no longer just a struggling business. It was a crime scene, and he was the hyper-vigilant detective, examining the blood splatter of his ruined marriage. Every detail he had previously ignored, or chalked up to the stress of Aura's slow recovery, now pulsed with radioactive significance. He noticed the subtle, insidious changes. The perfume she wore, for instance. For 7 years, Corinne had worn a soft, understated jasmine scent, a fragrance that never overpowered the delicate aromas of the dining room. But on a Tuesday evening, as she brushed past him in the narrow hallway leading to the pass, a heavy, intoxicating wave of dark amber and crushed fig hit him. It was a scent that didn't belong in a Michelin-starred service. It was the scent of a dimly lit hotel room. It was a scent meant to be inhaled from bare skin, not a pristine uniform. Florian stopped dead in his tracks, a plate of langoustines trembling slightly in his hands. He watched her walk away, noting the subtle sway of her hips, the way her tailored blazer seemed to fit just a fraction tighter than before. She was blooming, radiating a terrifying, vibrant energy that had been absent for months. It was the glow of a woman who was desired, who was touched, who was loved, just not by him. Then there were the supplier meetings. "I have a meeting with the new organic wine importer," she announced lightly on a Thursday afternoon, adjusting her scarf in the reflection of the host's stand. "It might run late. Don't wait up for me to lock up." Florian stood by the espresso machine, polishing a silver spoon with agonizing slowness. 6 months ago, he would have barely registered her words, consumed by the inventory of the dry store. Now he saw the slight flutter of her eyelashes, the way she avoided meeting his gaze directly. He saw the nervous energy vibrating in her fingertips as she checked her phone for the 10th time in 5 minutes. "Of course," Florian replied, his voice terrifyingly even, devoid of any inflection. "Take your time. Is it the importer from Fredericksburg?" Corinne hesitated, a microsecond of panic flashing across her elegant features before the mask slipped back into place. "No, Osterbro. A new boutique agency." "Ah," Florian said, setting the spoon down. "Drive safe. The weather is turning." He watched her leave through the heavy glass doors, the bell chiming a cheerful, mocking goodbye. He knew, with absolute, sickening certainty, that she was not going to Osterbro. She was going to the Dangleterre, to room 412, to Faustine. The agony of pretending he knew nothing was a slow-acting poison. It seeped into his bones, tainting everything he touched. He found himself dissecting their brief interactions, searching for the hidden meanings in her smiles, the hollow echo in her good nights. When she would finally return to the restaurant late at night, her lipstick slightly smudged, her eyes bright and dilated, he would meticulously craft a facade of weary indifference, asking about the wine importer, while his imagination painted agonizingly detailed pictures of her intertwined with the critic. He was a chef. He understood the anatomy of a slow roast, the precise temperature at which connective tissue breaks down and melts. He was experiencing that breakdown within his own soul. The connective tissue of their marriage, trust, shared history, mutual respect, was disintegrating under the slow, agonizing heat of her betrayal and his silence. He was marinating in his own humiliation, waiting for the exact right moment to serve it cold. The restaurant was finally empty, the last lingering diners having been gracefully ushered out by the junior maitre d'. It was 2 a.m., the hour when the ghosts of Aura, the lost stars, the shattered ambitions, the silent accusations, usually began to scream the loudest. Florian sat alone in the cramped, airless office tucked away behind the main kitchen. The only illumination came from the harsh, flickering glow of the single overhead bulb, casting long, distorted shadows across the mountains of unpaid invoices and inventory lists. On the battered metal desk, directly in front of him, lay Corinne's sleek silver iPad. She had left it behind, a rare oversight fueled, perhaps, by the intoxicating rush of another imminent meeting at the Dangleterre. He stared at it for a long, agonizing hour. His hands, usually so steady with a scalpel-sharp boning knife, were trembling violently. He knew her passcode. He had always known it. Their anniversary, a date that now felt like a cruel punchline to a devastating joke. August 14th. The dilemma was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. To open it was to cross a point of no return. It was one thing to overhear a conversation, to notice a new perfume, to suspect the worst. It was another thing entirely to read the written script of his own execution. If he unlocked that screen, the last, desperate shred of denial he clung to would be incinerated. He would be holding the bloody murder weapon in his hands. But the silence had become a ravenous beast, gnawing at his sanity. He couldn't survive another day of her painted-on smiles and hollow excuses. He needed the agonizing, absolute truth. He reached out, his finger hovering over the glass screen, a bead of cold sweat trickling down his spine. He keyed in the numbers. The screen bloomed into life, revealing her home screen, a carefully curated aesthetic of sleek minimalist designs and productivity apps. He bypassed the emails, the reservation system, the accounting software, his finger drawn with magnetic, morbid curiosity to the encrypted messaging app hidden in a secondary folder. He tapped it. It opened without a secondary password. A single thread dominated the top of the list. No name, just a black square emoji. Florian's stomach plummeted into an abyss as he opened the thread and began to scroll upwards, plunging into the dark, secret history of his wife's betrayal. It wasn't just a physical affair, it was a deeply emotional, intricately woven tapestry of deceit. The progression was sickening. He scrolled past months of messages, watching the slow, insidious decay of his marriage mapped out in digital text. I'm leaving the restaurant now. He's still in the kitchen. He barely looked at me. I missed your touch today. The air here is suffocating without you. Room 412 is booked for Thursday. I told him I have a meeting with the Osterborough importer. The words were knives, plunging into his chest with methodical precision. But what truly broke him, what shattered the final remnants of his soul, were the photos. He stopped scrolling, staring blankly at a high-resolution image sent 3 weeks ago. It was a selfie of Corinza, lying in the center of a massive, impossibly white king-sized bed. The luxurious sheets of the Dangleterre were tangled around her bare legs. She was looking at the camera with a soft, satiated, adoring expression, an expression she hadn't worn for Florian in years. And in the background, out of focus but unmistakable, was the broad, arrogant silhouette of Faustine, pouring 2 glasses of champagne. A raw, guttural sob tore its way out of Florian's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed in the tiny office. He clamped a hand over his mouth, biting his own knuckles until he tasted blood, terrified someone might hear him. He read messages where they dissected Florian's obsession, mocking his desperate attempts to regain the Michelin star. He read how Faustine promised to take her away to Paris, to a life free from the suffocating pressure of Aura's slow death. He read his wife's eager, desperate agreements. The iPad slipped from his shaking hands, clattering onto the metal desk. The screen went dark, plunging the office back into the harsh, unforgiving shadows. Florian sat frozen, the agonizing truth now burning through his veins, an acidic venom replacing his blood. He was no longer a man. He was a hollowed-out vessel, entirely consumed by a cold, calculated, terrifying rage. The chef in him was dead. The architect of vengeance had just awoken. The Saturday evening service at Aura was a masterclass in controlled chaos, a choreographed ballet of fire, steel, and adrenaline. To the elite patrons dining in the muted, dimly lit elegance of the front of house, it was an effortless symphony of gastronomy. To the brigade in the back, it was a war zone. And at the center of it all stood Florian, an icy general surveying a battlefield he no longer cared to win. He stood at the pass, the stainless steel border that separated the roaring inferno of the kitchen from the tranquil dining room. Under the harsh halogen heat lamps, He meticulously arranged delicate, translucent leaves of microsorrel over a seared pigeon breast. The ruby-red reduction pooling around the meat looked remarkably like freshly spilled blood. Through the circular porthole window of the swinging doors, he watched Corinza. She was enchanting. She glided between the tables with the effortless grace of a swan, her dark hair pinned back, her smile radiant and disarming. She leaned in to pour a vintage burgundy for a table of Swiss diplomats, her laughter ringing out like crystal. She was the perfect hostess, the beating heart of Aura. Florian gripped the edge of the plating counter, his knuckles turning a bone white. The phantom weight of her iPad still burned against his palms. How easily she lied. How flawlessly she performed. He realized, with a sickening twist of his stomach, that the woman out there was a stranger. The Corinza he knew, or thought he knew, had been dead for months, replaced by this brilliant, hollow actress who sought her applause in room 412 of the D'Angleterre. Chef. The voice of his sous chef, a talented but anxious young man named Lars, broke through the roaring static in Florian's mind. The turbot is resting, chef. Do we fire the garnish? Lars asked, eyeing Florian with a subtle, rising panic. Florian had been staring at the swinging doors for a full 2 minutes without calling a single ticket. Florian blinked slowly, drawing his gaze away from his wife. The intense heat of the stove seemed to suddenly evaporate from his skin, leaving behind a glacial, terrifying clarity. Fire the garnish, Lars, Florian said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding completely devoid of human warmth. And ensure the puree is passed through the Tammys twice. It must be absolutely flawless tonight. As the kitchen roared back to life around him, the dilemma tore at his insides. He could walk out there right now. He could march into the dining room, his apron stained with meat juices, and scream the truth. He could flip the tables, shatter the crystal, and expose her beautiful, deceitful face to the entire room. He could burn Aura to the ground in a spectacular blaze of humiliated fury. But as he watched his hands, steady, precise, lethal, deftly trim a piece of fat from a prime cut, a darker, more sophisticated instinct took over. A chef of his caliber did not just throw raw, unseasoned ingredients onto a plate in a fit of passion. A master chef understood patience. He understood the slow, methodical breakdown of connective tissue, the gradual application of heat, the careful building of complex, overwhelming flavors. If he confronted her now, it would be a messy, chaotic explosion. He would be the hysterical, broken man Faustine had painted him to be in that godforsaken review. No, he would not give them that satisfaction. He looked back through the porthole just as Corinza met his eyes through the glass. She flashed him a quick, encouraging smile, the supportive wife checking in on her brilliant, troubled husband. Florian did not smile back. He merely gave a curt, professional nod before turning his attention back to the ticket rail. The decision was made. He would not just burn down his marriage. He would construct a tasting menu of absolute ruin. He would serve them their betrayal, course by agonizing course, until there was nothing left of them but ashes. The kitchen was dark again, smelling of cold grease and bleach. It was 3:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. The rhythmic hum of the massive walk-in refrigerators was the only sound in the cavernous space. Florian sat alone at the small, stainless steel prep table, usually reserved for butchering fish, the harsh overhead fluorescent light casting deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes. Corinza's iPad lay in front of him, glowing with a malevolent, sterile light. He had promised himself he wouldn't look again. He had promised himself he would focus entirely on the new menu, the intricate, psychological trap he was meticulously designing for Faustine and his treacherous wife. But the digital archive of their affair exerted a gravitational pull that was impossible to resist. He needed to understand the architecture of his own destruction. He needed to know how it started. He scrolled past the recent, agonizing messages, the hotel arrangements, the professions of love, the cruel jokes about his obsession with the Michelin Guide. He scrolled back through months of deceit, his fingers swiping relentlessly until he hit the very beginning of the thread. The first message was dated November 18th, Florian's breath caught in his throat. That was exactly 2 days after Faustine's review had hit the newsstands. It was the night Florian had locked himself in the wine cellar, a bottle of cheap brandy in one hand and his favorite Japanese carbon steel chef's knife in the other, staring blankly at his own wrists until dawn. He tapped the screen, his hands trembling violently as he read Corinza's first message to the critic. Mr. Faustine, my name is Corinza, general manager of Aura. I am writing to you not to dispute your palate, but to beg for a retraction. My husband is not just a chef, he is an artist, and your words have shattered his will to live. Please, I am terrified he will not survive the week. I will do whatever it takes to make you reconsider. Name your price. Florian stared at the screen, the words blurring as a hot, agonizing tear spilled over his eyelashes and splashed onto the sterile glass. His chest heaved, a jagged sob tearing itself from his throat. The raw, desperate plea in her message was entirely devoid of the polished, manipulative charm she usually employed. It was the frantic, bleeding cry of a woman trying to drag her husband back from the edge of the abyss. She hadn't reached out to Faustine out of lust or boredom. She had reached out to him because she believed Florian was going to kill himself. The devastating irony of it hit him with the force of a physical blow. Her initial act of betrayal was, in its twisted, horrific origin, an act of profound, sacrificial love. She had offered herself up to the devil to buy back Florian's soul. He scrolled down, reading Faustine's arrogant, amused reply. Whatever it takes, Corinza? That is a dangerous promise to make to a man in my position. Meet me at the D'Angleterre lobby bar at 9 p.m. tomorrow. Alone. Let us discuss the price of a chef's sanity. Florian closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold steel of the prep table. The dilemma was agonizing, twisting his heart into unrecognizable shapes. Did this initial sacrifice absolute her? Did the fact that she had thrown herself onto the grenade of Faustine's ego to save Florian's life somehow justify the months of lies and the eventual, genuine romance she had found with the critic? No. He opened his eyes, the brief flash of vulnerability hardening back into a glacial, terrifying resolve. The origin of the fire didn't matter when the house was already burned to the ground. She might have started out trying to save him, but somewhere along the line, she had stopped fighting the devil and started sleeping with him. She had chosen Faustine. She had chosen the hotel room over the struggling restaurant. She had chosen the critic over the chef. The tragedy of her initial motive only made her ultimate corruption more unforgivable. It meant she wasn't just a traitor. She was a casualty of her own desperate gambit, and Florian was the one left to clean up the wreckage. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, his eyes locking back onto the iPad screen. The tears were gone. The masterclass in revenge was still on schedule. The morning sun over Copenhagen was a pale, watery illusion of warmth, doing nothing to thaw the glacial atmosphere inside Aura. Florian stood at the head of the long, polished oak table in the private dining room, the very room where he intended to execute his final, devastating performance. Corinza sat opposite him, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked immaculate, as always, in a tailored charcoal blazer and a silk blouse, but the exhaustion she usually managed to hide behind a layer of expensive foundation was glaringly obvious in the harsh morning light. I've made a decision, Florian announced, his voice slicing through the heavy silence. He didn't look at her directly, instead focusing his gaze on the intricate floral arrangement in the center of the table. We are hosting a private, highly exclusive tasting menu this Saturday. One table only. The main dining room will be closed. Corinza blinked, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through her carefully constructed mask. Close the restaurant on a Saturday? Florian, we can't afford that. The revenue. The revenue is irrelevant compared to the long-term survival of this establishment, Florian interrupted, his tone smooth and utterly devoid of its usual manic edge. He finally met her eyes, holding her gaze with a terrifying, blank intensity. We need a statement. We need to prove that Aura is not just alive, but resurrected. Corinza shifted uncomfortably, a subtle tightening around her mouth. Who is the table for? Florian allowed a microscopic, almost imperceptible smile to touch the corners of his lips. Faustine. The name dropped between them like a live grenade. Corinza physically recoiled, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of pure, instinctual panic. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. Faustine, she repeated, her voice a hollow, breathless echo. Florian, no? Are you insane? He destroyed us. He wrote that we were a mausoleum. You can't invite him back. I am not insane, Corinza. I have never been more lucid, Florian replied, leaning forward slightly, his eyes boring into hers. He destroyed us because I gave him the ammunition. I was stagnant. I was arrogant. But I have evolved. I have created a menu that will not just challenge his palate. It will annihilate his previous assessment. He watched her carefully, dissecting every micro-expression. He saw the terror warring with confusion in her dark eyes. He saw the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her chest. I sent the invitation personally this morning, Florian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A challenge. A peace offering. And to my surprise, he accepted. He will be here at 8 o'clock. Alone. Corinza swallowed hard, her throat working convulsively. The dilemma was agonizingly visible on her face. Florian could almost read the frantic calculations behind her eyes. Does he know? Is this a trap? Do I call Faustine? Do I warn him? If she warned the critic, if she told him Florian was behaving erratically, Faustine might cancel. The trap would fail. But if she did, she risked exposing the depth of her own communication with the man who had supposedly ruined their lives. She had to play the part of the devoted, terrified wife. Florian, please, Corinza whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Her fingers were ice cold. Don't do this to yourself. If he writes another bad review, it will kill you. It will kill us. The sheer audacity of her lie, the counterfeit concern dripping from her voice, ignited a fresh, searing wave of fury in Florian's chest. He looked down at her hand resting on his, fighting the urge to shatter every bone in her delicate wrist. Instead, he slowly, deliberately pulled his hand away. There will be no bad review, my love, Florian said softly, his voice a chilling caress. Because this menu is perfect. It is a masterpiece of deconstruction. I want you to serve him personally. I want him to look you in the eye as he eats his words. Corinza stared at him, her eyes wide with a terror she could not fully conceal. She nodded slowly, completely trapped in the web he had spun. Good, Florian said, standing up and smoothing his apron. Prepare the private room. The service will be flawless. He turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving his wife alone in the silent, suffocating dining room, the architect of her own impending ruin. The private dining room at Aura was an exercise in sensory deprivation, designed to focus entirely on the palate. The walls were a matte, charcoal gray, absorbing the ambient light and amplifying the brilliant, focused beam illuminating the center of the heavy oak table. Tonight, that spotlight felt more like an interrogation lamp. At precisely 8 p.m., Faustine arrived. He was a large man, exuding an aura of arrogant, comfortable wealth. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue suit that strained slightly against his broad shoulders, and a smile that was both charming and predatory. He moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of an apex predator entering a familiar hunting ground. From his vantage point behind the swinging kitchen doors, Florian watched his wife greet the critic. Corinza's performance was breathtakingly flawless, and yet terrifyingly brittle. She executed the perfect, deferential bow of a Michelin-level host. She offered a strained, polite smile that completely masked the frantic, erratic beating of her heart. To an untrained eye, she was simply nervous about serving the man who had nearly destroyed her business. But Florian, attuned to every microscopic shift in her demeanor, saw the minute tremor in her hands as she pulled out Faustine's chair, the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her chest beneath the silk blouse, and the desperate, pleading glance she shot toward the critic's face. A silent, frantic question. Did you know about this? Faustine, leaning back in his chair, simply raised a single, amused eyebrow at her, a gesture of supreme, intoxicating arrogance. He was enjoying this. He was entirely unaware he was sitting in an abattoir. "Welcome back to Aura, Monsieur Faustine," Corinza managed, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror radiating from her skin. "Chef Florian is honored to present a unique, retrospective tasting menu this evening. We begin with the amuse-bouche." Florian stepped up to the pass, his face a mask of terrifying, glacial calm. He handed Lars the first plate. "Course 1, Florian instructed, his voice slicing through the tense silence of the kitchen. "Serve it." The dish was visually stunning, a delicate, translucent sphere of sponge sugar resting on a bed of crushed, dark soil made from dehydrated black olives. But it was the filling that held the poison. Inside the fragile sugar shell was a sharp, aggressive reduction of bitter orange and bruised fig. It was the exact, unmistakable scent of the perfume Corinza had started wearing the week she first went to room 412. Florian watched through the porthole as Corinza approached the table and set the plate down with trembling hands. As Faustine cracked the sugar sphere with his spoon, the heavy, intoxicating aroma of dark amber and crushed fig instantly flooded the small room. Florian saw Corinza freeze. Her breath hitched audibly, her eyes widening in a sudden, violent realization. The scent hit her like a physical blow, a visceral, olfactory ghost from the Dangleterre. She stared at the plate, then snapped her gaze toward the kitchen doors, her face completely drained of color. "He knows." The thought must have screamed through her mind. But she couldn't run. She was trapped in the spotlight. "Interesting aroma," Faustine mused, inhaling deeply, entirely oblivious to the psychological warfare unfolding inches from his face. "Aggressive. A bit intimate for an opening course, wouldn't you say, Corinza?" It is a challenging profile, monsieur," Corinza stammered, her voice barely a whisper, backing away from the table as if the plate itself were radioactive. Florian didn't smile. He merely turned back to his prep station, his hands moving with lethal precision as he prepared the next course. The first knife had been thrown, and it had landed exactly where he intended. "Fire the second course, Lars," Florian commanded, his voice dead. The white linen. The tension in the kitchen was now a physical, suffocating entity. Lars handed him a pristine, square white plate. On it, Florian arranged a single, perfectly seared scallop. Beside it, he carefully draped a thin, translucent sheet of daikon radish, folded and creased to look exactly like the tangled, luxurious bedsheets of the Dangleterre Hotel. He finished it with a single, aggressive drop of bright red chili oil in the center. It looked exactly like the final photograph she had sent to Faustine. The air in the private dining room had grown dense, practically vibrating with an unspoken, suffocating panic. For courses had been served. For meticulously crafted, terrifyingly specific dishes that had systematically dismantled Corinza's composure. She was no longer the elegant, poised general manager of Aura. She was a ghost, her movements jagged and uncoordinated. With each plate she carried from the kitchen, the realization that her husband knew everything slammed into her with compounding, agonizing force. She had served a delicate tartare, seasoned with the exact brand of obscure Japanese whiskey Faustine kept in his suite. She had poured a vintage champagne from the very year of their first secret meeting. Faustine, however, remained arrogantly oblivious to the psychological slaughter occurring across the table. He ate with the slow, deliberate entitlement of a man who believed he owned the room, the food, and the woman serving it. He scribbled occasional, pretentious notes in a small leather-bound book, occasionally shooting Corinza a smug, conspiratorial smirk that she was too terrified to return. It was time for the main course. The crescendo. Inside the kitchen, the chaotic symphony of service had ground to a complete, unnatural halt. Florian stood alone at the central prep station, the harsh fluorescent lights casting his face in sharp, unforgiving angles. His brigade watched him in absolute, terrified silence. They didn't know the specifics of the war being waged, but the radioactive intensity radiating from their chef was enough to keep them frozen in place. Lars, Florian commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that echoed off the stainless steel. Clear the line. Everyone out. Now. The sous chef didn't hesitate. Within seconds, the kitchen was entirely empty, leaving Florian alone with the final dish. He did not plate a piece of meat. He did not arrange a delicate garnish. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and withdrew a heavy, polished silver cloche, the kind used for the most dramatic, theatrical presentations in classic French dining. Beneath it, he did not place food. He placed Corinne's sleek silver iPad, its screen awake and unlocked, glowing with the damning, undeniable evidence of her betrayal. He rested it on a pristine white napkin, the screen displaying the photograph of her tangled in the sheets of room 412, with Faustine's silhouette in the background. Florian lifted the silver dome, his reflection staring back at him in the polished metal. His eyes were completely dead, devoid of rage, sorrow, or humanity. He was merely an executioner holding the axe. He pushed through the swinging doors for the first time that evening. The heavy thud of his boots on the hardwood floor of the private dining room broke the stifling silence. Corinne, who had been standing rigidly by the sideboard, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Faustine paused, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly at the sight of the chef's bloodless, terrifying expression. Florian didn't speak. He walked directly to the heavy double oak doors that led to the main hallway, turned the brass deadbolt with a loud, resounding click, and slipped the heavy iron key into the pocket of his apron. They were locked in. The trap was sprung. He turned slowly, carrying the silver dome with the reverence of a priest presenting the Eucharist. He walked to the head of the table, stopping directly between his wife and the man who had destroyed his life. Florian, Corinne whispered, her voice cracking, tears welling in her eyes, finally overflowing the dam of her terror. She took a step backward, pressing herself against the gray wall. Please, what are you doing? Faustine finally set his bread down, his heavy brow furrowing in irritation. Chef Florian, a dramatic entrance. Is this part of the retrospective experience? Lock down the critic? He attempted a laugh, but it sounded thin and hollow in the freezing room. Florian ignored him completely. He placed the heavy silver cloche directly in the center of the illuminated table, right in front of Faustine. The final course, Monsieur Faustine, Florian said, his voice dropping to a chilling, silken whisper that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. A dish I have been preparing for 6 months. A masterclass in raw, unadulterated reality. He gripped the silver handle. Corinne let out a small, strangled sob, sinking to her knees against the wall, her hands covering her face. She knew exactly what was underneath. Florian lifted the dome. The harsh, sterile light of the iPad screen cut through the dim ambience of the room. The photograph of Corinne and Faustine, intimate and devastating, stared up at them from the white napkin. Below the image, the text of their most recent exchange was clearly visible. I'll leave him soon. The restaurant is dying anyway. I belong to you now. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and absolute. The iPad screen glowed like a radioactive core in the center of the oak table. The silence in the private dining room was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to crack the very foundation of the room. Faustine stared at the glowing tablet, his heavy features cycling rapidly through confusion, shock, and finally, a deep, ugly shade of crimson. The arrogant mask of the untouchable critic dissolved, revealing the bloated, cornered animal underneath. He looked from the damning photograph to Florian's dead, unblinking eyes, then down to Corinne, who was sobbing softly against the charcoal wall. What is the meaning of this, Florian? Faustine demanded, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. It was thin, reeking of sudden, desperate panic. He tried to stand, his heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood, but his knees seemed to betray him, keeping him awkwardly half-risen. Is this some kind of a blackmail? A pathetic attempt to salvage your ruined reputation by resorting to cheap parlor tricks? Florian didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still at the head of the table, his chef's whites pristine, his hands folded neatly behind his back. He looked at the critic with the detached, clinical interest of a man observing a dying insect. Blackmail implies I want something from you, Monsieur Faustine, Florian replied, his voice a glacial, perfectly modulated whisper that cut through the room like a scalpel. I want nothing from you. I already have everything I need. I simply wanted you to understand the true cost of your objective journalism. He turned his gaze slowly toward his wife. Corinza was a broken, beautiful ruin. The impeccable general manager of Aura was gone, replaced by a trembling, sobbing woman hugging her knees. The flawless mascara was running in dark, jagged tracks down her cheeks. Florian, please, she choked out, her voice raw and broken, reaching a trembling hand out toward him. You don't understand. Let me explain. It didn't start like this. I know exactly how it started, Corinza, Florian said, the absolute lack of emotion in his voice more terrifying than any scream. He walked slowly around the table, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. November 18th. 2 days after his review. Name your price. A noble, tragic sacrifice to save your suicidal husband from the edge of the abyss. How remarkably poetic. Corinza gasped, her eyes widening in absolute horror. He knew everything. He had read every single word. You read the first messages? She whispered, her voice barely audible over her own ragged breathing. Then you know I did it for you. I sold my soul to him to buy back your life. You were dying, Florian. You were locked in that cellar with a knife. Yes, Florian agreed softly, stopping a few feet away from her. He looked down at her tear-streaked face, feeling absolutely nothing. You offered yourself to the devil to save me. A beautiful tragedy. But tragedy, my dear, requires a certain purity of intent. He leaned down slightly, his face inches from hers. The coldness radiating from him seemed to freeze the tears on her cheeks. If it was truly a sacrifice, Corinza, why did you stop crying? Florian asked, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate purr. Why did the hotel rooms become a sanctuary instead of a prison? Why did you start wearing the perfume he liked? Why did you laugh at my obsession with the stars while tangled in his sheets? Corinza squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh wave of violent sobs tearing through her small frame. She had no answer. The ugly, undeniable truth was that her sacrifice had mutated into a genuine, toxic desire. She had fallen in love with her captor because her husband had become a ghost. Faustine, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, slammed his heavy hand onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses. He had regained a fraction of his arrogance, fueled by the humiliated desperation of the woman crying on the floor. Enough of this pathetic melodrama. Faustine barked, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and a sick, twisted pride. You think you're a martyr, Florian? You're a failure. You drove her to me. You neglected her, you starved her of affection, and I simply offered her what you were too obsessed to provide. A real man. A life outside this sterile, sinking mausoleum. He sneered, a cruel, ugly expression contorting his face. She begged me, Florian. She begged me on her knees to give you your precious star back. And in return, she gave me everything you couldn't handle. Florian slowly turned his head to look at the critic. A microscopic, terrifying smile touched the very corners of his lips. The final piece of the trap had just snapped shut. Faustine had spoken the exact words Florian needed him to say. The confession was complete. The venom in Faustine's voice hung in the frigid air of the private dining room. His cruel, triumphant smile was a grotesque mask of victory, born from the absolute certainty that he had won. He believed he had broken the chef, stolen his wife, and was now successfully humiliating him in his own establishment. Florian didn't move. He simply stared at the bloated critic, the microscopic smile never leaving his lips. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on Faustine's chest, causing his smirk to falter. Are you quite finished, Monsieur Faustine? Florian asked, his voice returning to that terrifyingly calm, conversational tone. He walked slowly back to the head of the table, his eyes fixed entirely on the iPad screen still glowing beneath the silver cloche. He didn't look at Corinza, who remained curled against the wall, her sobs subsiding into broken, ragged breaths. "I am finished," Faustine spat, adjusting his tie with a sudden, nervous jerk of his thick fingers. He glanced nervously at the locked double doors. "Unlock the door, Florian. I am leaving. And trust me, when I write about this little episode, Aura will be nothing but a footnote in the history of Copenhagen's failures." Florian let out a short, dry chuckle that sounded like cracking ice. "Write about it? Oh, Faustine, you don't understand, do you? Your career as a journalist ended exactly 3 minutes ago." Faustine frowned, his heavy brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about, you lunatic?" Florian picked up the iPad. With a single, deliberate swipe of his thumb, he closed the encrypted messaging app containing the photographs of Corinza. The screen switched instantly to a different application. It was a live audio streaming platform, the interface glowing with a stark, red on air indicator. Below it, a counter ticked steadily upwards, currently displaying over 10,000 active listeners. Faustine's face drained of blood so rapidly he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "A private dining room, yes," Florian murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the acoustics of the space. "But a very public execution." He tapped the screen, and the interface expanded. "You see, Faustine, I didn't just invite you here tonight. I invited the entire editorial board of the European Culinary Gazette. I invited every major food critic in Paris, London, and New York. I sent a discreet, anonymous link to the top culinary blogs across the continent, promising them an exclusive, live retrospective of the man who breaks careers with a single pen stroke." Florian took a step toward the paralyzed critic, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "And they have been listening, Faustine," Florian continued, his voice rising, filling the room with the precise, rhythmic cadence of a master chef calling a complex ticket. "They heard you dissect the white linen course. They heard my wife sob. And most importantly, they heard you confess, in your own arrogant, boastful words, that you exchanged a favorable Michelin review for sexual favors." Corinza let out a sharp, horrified gasp, scrambling to her feet, her hands tearing at her hair. "Florian, no? You broadcasted this? You destroyed yourself to destroy him." Florian finally looked at her, his expression a mask of absolute, terrifying emptiness. "I destroyed nothing that wasn't already in ashes, Corinza." He turned back to Faustine, who was now trembling visibly, sweat beading on his forehead, his heavy breathing sounding like a dying engine. The arrogant kingmaker was gone. He was a ruined man, staring at the instrument of his destruction. "Journalistic integrity, Monsieur Faustine," Florian whispered, leaning across the table, his face inches from the critic's sweaty skin. "A delicate, fragile thing, much like spun sugar. One sharp tap, and it shatters completely." With a final, decisive movement, Florian tapped the end stream button. The red light died. The silence returned, thicker and more absolute than before. "The review you write tomorrow will not matter, Faustine," Florian said, straightening up, his voice dead. "Because by tomorrow morning, you will not have a publication to print it in. You are finished." He reached into his apron, withdrew the heavy iron key, and unlocked the double oak doors. They swung open with a heavy groan, revealing the empty, sterile hallway leading to the front of house. "Get out of my restaurant," Florian commanded. Faustine didn't say a word. He stumbled from his chair, his face a mask of absolute, terrified shock. He practically ran through the doors, disappearing into the shadows, a ghost fleeing a graveyard. Florian stood alone in the center of the room, looking down at the empty iPad screen, the taste of ashes coating his tongue. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room stood open, framing the empty, shadowed hallway like the entrance to a tomb. Faustine's frantic footsteps had faded into the Copenhagen night long ago, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in Florian's ears. Corinza was still on the floor, her back pressed against the charcoal wall. She hadn't moved since the live stream ended. Her tears had dried, leaving tight, jagged tracks through her flawless makeup. She looked incredibly small, a shattered porcelain doll discarded in the corner of a room she used to command with effortless grace. Florian slowly began to clear the table. He moved with the same terrifying, mechanical precision he used during a busy service. He picked up the delicate sugar sphere, now melted into a sticky, bitter puddle of fig and amber scent. He gathered the pristine white plate holding the untouched, cold scallop and the radish sculpted like tangled bedsheets. He stacked them neatly, the clinking of porcelain the only sound in the suffocating room. "It's over, Corinza," Florian said softly, his voice devoid of anger, sorrow, or triumph. It was the hollow sound of a wind blowing through an abandoned building. She flinched at his voice, slowly raising her head. Her eyes, once bright with ambition and later, toxic passion, were now dull and vacant. "You destroyed everything," she whispered, her voice cracking, a raspy echo of the elegant host she used to be. "You destroyed him. You destroyed me. And you destroyed yourself in front of the entire culinary world." Florian paused, holding a heavy crystal wine glass by the stem. He looked at her, his expression a mask of glacial calm. "I excised a rot, Corinza," he corrected her softly. "Faustine will never write another word. His corruption is public record. He will be pariah before sunrise." He set the glass down on his tray. "As for Aura, you are mistaken. I haven't destroyed it. I have resurrected it. The culinary world thrives on scandal. They will flock here now, not for the food, but to sit in the very room where the great Faustine was slaughtered. We will be booked solid for a year." Corinza stared at him, a profound, chilling realization settling over her delicate features. She finally understood the magnitude of his obsession. He hadn't just orchestrated a revenge plot. He had engineered a spectacular, grotesque marketing campaign using their broken marriage as the main course. "You really are a monster, Florian," she breathed, slowly pushing herself up from the floor. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand, smoothing the wrinkles in her charcoal blazer with shaking hands. "You care more about this building, about those godforsaken stars, than you ever cared about a human soul, even your own." Florian didn't answer. He watched her walk slowly toward the open doors, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood, a rhythmic, mournful sound that echoed the night she had begged him to come home months ago. She stopped at the threshold, turning back to look at him one last time. The woman who had sacrificed herself to a devil, only to fall in love with him, now looked at her husband with nothing but absolute, freezing pity. "Keep the stars, chef," Corinza whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. She turned and walked down the hallway, her silhouette dissolving into the shadows of the restaurant she had helped build. The heavy front door chimed a cheerful, mocking goodbye, and then the heavy lock clicked into place. Florian was entirely alone. He stood in the center of the private dining room, the harsh spotlight illuminating the empty chairs and the cleared table. He had won. The review was nullified. The critic was ruined. The traitor was exiled. Aura was safe. He slowly walked back into the main kitchen. The stainless steel prep stations gleamed under the fluorescent lights, sterile and pristine. The massive, roaring stoves were cold and silent. He ran a hand over the edge of his cutting board, feeling the familiar, comforting grain of the wood. He looked up at the wall where, years ago, he had proudly hung their first Michelin plaque. He knew, with absolute certainty, that they would get it back now. The hype, the morbid curiosity, the sheer theatrical genius of his revenge would guarantee it. Florian stood in the freezing, absolute silence of his empty empire, the bitter taste of his Pyrrhic victory settling permanently in his mouth. He looked at the empty space on the wall, the silence roaring in his ears. The stars were finally ours, Florian whispered to the empty, gleaming kitchen, a single, agonizing tear finally escaping his dead eyes. But there was no one left to shine them for.